The late summer stillness hangs heavy over the fort, broken only by the rhythmic thud of axes striking pine trunks in the distance. A dozen civilian laborers, their shirts dark with sweat, work methodically among the towering trees, the fresh scent of pine sap filling the air as each mighty trunk crashes to the forest floor. Their temporary camp, a collection of canvas tents and crude wooden shelters, has become a permanent fixture in the clearing, necessary for the endless task of supplying the fort with timber. From our position behind the hastily assembled fortification of wagon beds, the vast expanse of prairie stretches endlessly before us, the makeshift walls offering little comfort against potential attack. The memory of Captain Fetterman's catastrophic defeat weighs heavily on every soldier's mind. 81 men lost in a single ill-fated charge, their bodies discovered mutilated in the snow. That brutal lesson has transformed every routine patrol into a careful operation, every wood-cutting detail into a tactical challenge. Throughout the summer months, Sioux warriors and their northern Cheyenne allies have maintained a relentless campaign of harassment. They materialize like ghosts from the rolling hills, striking at our wood-cutting parties and hay-gatherers before vanishing into the landscape. Intelligence from our scouts confirms that RedCloud himself orchestrates these operations from his camp in the Rosebud Valley, a location that taunts us with its proximity. The old chief's strategic acumen is evident in every move. He has accurately assessed our limited manpower, knowing we lack the strength to mount any significant offensive against his position. His warriors maintain an intricate network of surveillance, appearing on distant ridgelines at dawn and dusk, probing our defenses with small-scale attacks that never quite escalate to full engagement. These tactics serve a dual purpose, testing our responses while preserving his warriors' strength. The monotony of siege warfare has driven some of the more aggressive braves, notably the warrior Romanos, to seek combat elsewhere. Their raiding parties have ranged hundreds of miles south into Kansas, striking at targets of opportunity between the Smoky Hill and Platte rivers. Fresh reports from our scouts indicate these warriors have returned north, flush with success and spoils. The pattern of victory that began with Fetterman's destruction continues to embolden them, each successful raid against settlers adding to their growing confidence. The bitter winds of Wyoming Territory swept across the plains with increasing ferocity as winter approached, compelling both sides to consider their tactical positions. Military intelligence suggested RedCloud would likely launch his assault before the snows deepened, using the last moments of autumn to press his advantage. As 1867 dawned, the warrior chief demonstrated his strategic patience, maintaining an iron grip on Fort Phil Kearney through the harshest months of winter, his reputation as an intractable opponent of white expansion growing with each passing day. RedCloud commanded substantial forces, though the winter months saw many of his warriors dispersing to their traditional winter camps. The sheltered valleys of Crazy Woman Canyon and the protected stretches of Powder River Valley filled with the smoke of countless lodge fires as Sioux families settled in for the season. While most of his people celebrated the winter months with traditional dances and feasting in these protected enclaves, RedCloud maintained his vigilance. The warrior chief established his command post in a Spartan teepee along the Little Goose River, surrounded by his elite band of Bad Faces warriors. From this exposed position, he coordinated continuous reconnaissance of the fort, demonstrating the dedication that had earned him the name Grim Chief among his followers. The situation at Fort Phil Kearney shifted dramatically when General Cook, commander of the Department of the Platte, implemented a change in leadership. General Carrington's command ended abruptly with his relief, and Brigadier General Henry W. Wessels assumed control of the fort's destiny. On January 16th, Wessels rode in with significant reinforcements, 2 full companies of cavalry and 4 of infantry, their arrival bringing the fort's military strength to an impressive 300 men. The transition of command occurred during nature's fiercest assault. On January 23rd, General Carrington led a somber procession from the fort, accompanied by his wife and a group of civilians that included the pregnant widow of Lieutenant Grumman. The bitter journey to Fort Laramie tested the limits of human endurance. with temperatures plunging to 38 degrees below zero. The severity of the cold left its mark on Carrington's escort. 30 of the 60 soldiers suffered frostbite during their watchful guard of the civilian convoy. General Wessels attempted to seize the initiative with an aggressive winter campaign against RedCloud's forces, but Wyoming's merciless weather proved an insurmountable opponent. The extreme cold forced him to recall his troops, postponing offensive operations until spring. During this period of enforced inaction, fissures appeared in RedCloud's coalition. The chief struggled to maintain the commitment of his warriors to the prolonged siege, facing internal political challenges that tested his leadership. Most notably, Man Afraid of His Horses, the hereditary chief of the Oglala Sioux, harbored deep resentment toward RedCloud's meteoric rise to prominence. The traditional leader bristled at his diminished influence, creating tension within the tribal power structure that threatened to undermine the unity of the siege force. On June 12th, Man Afraid of His Horses orchestrated a dramatic shift in the conflict's dynamics by approaching the government with peace proposals. In a formal meeting with the Washington Peace Commission, the Oglala leader presented himself as a voice of reconciliation, expressing his people's desire to end the prolonged hostilities. The negotiations proceeded smoothly until he made a critical diplomatic misstep, requesting ammunition supplies as part of the peace terms. This tactical error proved fatal to the negotiations, as government officials immediately interpreted it as a sign of insincerity. The request transformed what might have been a breakthrough moment into yet another failed peace initiative. The government's swift rejection of the ammunition request left Man Afraid of His Horses with no recourse, but to withdraw into the wilderness, his diplomatic failure evident to all parties. His retreat served only to strengthen RedCloud's position among the tribes. The contrast between Man Afraid of His Horse's unsuccessful peace overture and RedCloud's sustained military pressure against the forts heightened the latter's influence, cementing his reputation as the most effective leader in the resistance against white expansion. As RedCloud's prestige grew, Generals Terry and Augur recognized the urgent need to reinforce the frontier's defensive infrastructure. Their strategy focused on transforming the rudimentary fortifications they had inherited into a more robust defensive network. General Terry, tasked specifically with securing the vital steamboat and overland routes to Montana, expanded upon the defensive framework established by General Sully. This system had been originally conceived during the campaigns of 1864 and 1865, implemented in response to the devastating Minnesota Massacre perpetrated by the Santee Sioux in 1864. The military's fortification strategy took shape through a carefully planned series of installations. New outposts, Forts Ransom and Toton, were strategically positioned to complement the established presence of Forts Abercrombie and Siston, also known as Wadsworth. These fortifications served as crucial waypoints along the primary travel routes connecting Minnesota to the Missouri River corridor and the mountains beyond. The military presence along the Missouri River itself underwent significant enhancement. The occasional military detachments at the trading outposts of Fort Union and Berthold were upgraded to permanent garrisons with the construction of Forts Buford and Stevenson nearby. These new installations, combined with the existing Forts Randall, Sully, and Rice downriver, established an unbroken chain of military oversight extending from the lower Missouri all the way to the Yellowstone's confluence. This network of fortifications created an unprecedented level of military control over the vital waterway, transforming what had been a vulnerable transportation route into a closely monitored corridor. In the Western Territories, General Terry addressed the defensive vulnerabilities exposed by the ineffective positioning of Camp Cook through a strategic realignment of military installations. His solution centered on the establishment of two crucial new fortifications in Montana Territory: Fort Shaw, positioned to control the Sun River region, and Fort Ellis, deliberately placed to guard a critical mountain pass, where Powder River Sioux warriors frequently threatened settlers in the fertile Gallatin Valley. These positions demonstrated the military's growing understanding of territorial defense requirements. General Augur simultaneously executed a comprehensive fortification strategy along the Union Pacific Railroad's westward expansion. As the railroad diverged from traditional immigrant routes at the Platte River forks, pushing westward along Lodgepole Creek, Augur implemented a sophisticated defensive network. Building upon the foundation of existing installations, Forts Kearney, McPherson, and Sedgwick, he strategically positioned 4 new fortifications: Fort Sidney, Fort D.A. Russell, Fort Sanders, and Fort Fred Steele. Each post was carefully situated to protect both survey teams mapping the railroad and the labor crews laying track through hostile territory. The reorganization of defenses along the North Platte corridor demonstrated Augur's pragmatic approach to resource allocation. While maintaining the strategically essential Fort Laramie, he made the calculated decision to abandon Forts Mitchell and Casper, consolidating his forces at more crucial points. The cornerstone of this reorganization was the establishment of Fort Fetterman at the critical junction where the Bozeman Trail branched northward from the Platte, creating a vital link in the chain of defenses that included Forts Reno, Phil Kearney, and C.F. Smith. The combined efforts of Terry and Augur produced an intricate defensive perimeter encircling the Sioux territories. Terry's 7 forts along the Missouri River, from Rando to Ellis, supported by 4 additional installations between Minnesota and the Missouri, created a formidable eastern barrier. Augur's network of 7 forts along the Platte and Bozeman Trail, complemented by 6 additional posts securing the Union Pacific line between the North and South Platte rivers, established equally strong defenses to the south. This extensive network required substantial manpower to maintain. Terry's command included 4 infantry regiments, the 10th, 13th, 22nd, and 31st, while Augur controlled 5 infantry regiments, the 4th, 18th, 27th, 30th, and 36th. Augur's forces gained additional mobility and intelligence-gathering capability through the attachment of the 2nd Cavalry, and a specialized battalion of Pawnee Scouts whose tracking and reconnaissance skills proved invaluable. Despite the impressive scope of this defensive network, encompassing approximately 5,000 military personnel deployed across a 2,500-mile perimeter, significant operational limitations remained. The predominantly infantry-based force lacked the mobility necessary for offensive operations, and their numbers, though substantial in aggregate, proved thin when spread across such vast distances. These tactical constraints, combined with political restrictions imposed by ongoing peace commission negotiations, forced the military to maintain a largely defensive posture. In stark contrast, their Sioux and Northern Cheyenne adversaries operated unencumbered by such limitations, maintaining freedom of movement and tactical initiative throughout their traditional territories. The military presence along the frontier sparked intense resistance among the Native American tribes, but it was the rapid transformation of their ancestral lands that fueled their deepest anger. Steamboats churned the waters of the Missouri in ever-increasing numbers, their hungry boilers consuming vast quantities of timber from the scarce woodlands along the river banks. The Union Pacific Railroad's westward march along the Platte brought with it a constant stream of surveyors, workers, and settlers. Most devastating was the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds, as hunting parties and construction crews pushed deeper into tribal territories. These incursions struck at the very foundation of tribal life, transforming the peace commissioners' diplomatic overtures into hollow gestures. The Dakota territories witnessed a significant shift in tribal power dynamics. 5 major Sioux bands, the Hunkpapa, Blackfeet, Minnekanjou, Sanzark, and Yanktonah, established their dominion over a vast region stretching from the lower Yellowstone and Little Missouri rivers to the Heart and Cannonball watersheds. Though RedCloud maintained his position of prominence, a new leader emerged who would reshape the resistance movement. Sitting Bull, a respected medicine man and tactical strategist, began drawing increasing numbers of warriors to his banner. His growing influence among the hostile bands marked him as a rising force in the struggle against white expansion. His reputation for unwavering opposition to American encroachment attracting warriors from across the tribal confederacy. The Upper Missouri became a theater of constant conflict as war parties launched coordinated attacks against multiple targets. Warriors demonstrated tactical versatility, striking at steamboats with precise rifle fire from concealed positions along the riverbanks, ambushing express riders who carried messages between military installations, and conducting raids against the woodcutter camps that supplied essential fuel to the steamboat fleet. They also intensified their traditional conflict with the Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa tribes, who had aligned themselves with the American government and depended on supplies from the Fort Berthold Agency for survival. The military responded to these escalating threats by establishing Fort Stevenson downstream from Fort Berthold, though its construction crews faced constant harassment from tribal raiders. The strategic positioning of Fort Berthold and Fort Stevenson on the Missouri's eastern bank provided natural defensive advantages, as the river's width created a significant tactical barrier against direct assault. However, this positioning created a critical vulnerability. The essential lumber operations required work parties to cross to the exposed western bank. These logging details faced persistent attacks from Sioux war parties, who utilized the dense riverside vegetation for cover while conducting lightning raids against the exposed workers. The military's communication network faced additional strain with the establishment of Fort Toton at Devil's Lake in 1867. The mail route connecting Fort Toton to Fort Stevenson became a prime target for Sitting Bull's mobile reconnaissance units, who monitored the trail with remarkable efficiency. Mail carriers who failed to maintain adequate security measures or traveled with insufficient escorts frequently encountered lethal ambushes. As the Sioux warriors perfected their interception tactics along this vital communication line. Fort Beaufort, established in 1866, encountered particularly aggressive opposition from Sioux forces. The fort's defenders faced a systematic campaign of economic warfare, as warriors executed well-planned raids to scatter the fort's crucial livestock herds. These operations frequently escalated into direct armed confrontations when cavalry units attempted to protect their herds or recover stolen animals. The warriors demonstrated tactical sophistication by waiting for soldiers to venture beyond the fort's defensive perimeter before launching their attacks, maximizing their advantage in mobility and local terrain knowledge. The Union Pacific Railroad's westward expansion faced coordinated resistance across multiple territories. Sioux raiding parties from the southern plains shadowed the railroad's progress across western Nebraska, while warriors from the Powder River encampments targeted survey teams attempting to mark the railroad's path through Wyoming territory. General Augur's defensive measures, though substantial, proved inadequate against these mobile threats. His commitment of 2 full infantry regiments and half a cavalry regiment to protection duties stretched his forces thin across the vast territory. The infantry's limited mobility and the cavalry's insufficient numbers created persistent gaps in the security network, leaving construction crews and survey teams vulnerable to swift, opportunistic attacks from tribal warriors who could choose the time and place of their engagements. The morning of June 26, 1867, marked a pivotal incident at Fort Wallace when Sergeant Frederick Williams met his end during a meticulously planned assault. Intelligence reports would later suggest the presence of Roman Nose, the distinguished warrior whose tactical brilliance had earned him recognition across the plains. The attacking force comprised a coordinated alliance of Arapaho, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors, demonstrating unprecedented intertribal cooperation in their approach to the fort. The warriors executed their attack with precision that spoke of careful planning and extensive preparation. Their initial approach appeared deceptively simple, a standard horse raiding party moving within sight of the fort's defenders. However, this familiar tactic masked a more sophisticated strategy. Having drawn the fort's attention, the warriors wheeled their mounts away in what seemed to be a retreat. Then, with stunning coordination, they executed their true attack plan. The entire party reversed direction in perfect unison, their war ponies moving with practiced grace as they charged back toward the fort. The sight and sound of their return struck with calculated psychological impact. Their war cries built from individual voices into an orchestrated chorus culminating in the distinctive war whoop that echoed across the prairie. Their mounts presented an equally intimidating spectacle, each pony adorned with carefully placed feathers marking previous victories and scalp locks that testified to their riders' combat prowess. These were not mere decorations, but declarations of martial achievement, the horses themselves trained to hold their heads high during the charge, their eyes scanning the battlefield with the same intensity as their riders. Dr. William Bell, an English physician present at Fort Wallace, demonstrated remarkable professional composure in the attack's aftermath. While the raiders' dust still hung in the air, Bell began his methodical documentation of the scene. His examination of Sergeant Williams's body revealed a precise catalog of wounds that would prove crucial to understanding the attack's participants. A bullet wound had penetrated the skull with lethal accuracy. A section of scalp lay near the body, though the majority had been removed with practiced skill. A precise tomahawk strike above the left eye had left unmistakable evidence of its impact. The nose bore careful, deliberate cuts that would later prove significant in identifying the attacking tribes. Bell's clinical analysis continued with the systematic precision of an academic lecture. His examination revealed specific tribal signatures in the attack's execution. The right arm muscles had been cut to the bone in a pattern that Bell identified as distinctively Cheyenne in origin. The careful slitting of the nose matched known Arapaho combat practices, marking the presence of the tribe sometimes known as the Smellers. A distinctive throat wound bore the hallmarks of Sioux warrior techniques. The legs displayed systematic gashes extending from hip to knee, executed in careful parallel patterns whose tribal origin remained unclear to Bell at the time. The forensic evidence extended beyond the wounds themselves. Arrows recovered from the scene displayed distinct tribal characteristics in their construction and decoration. Each projectile told its own story through specific manufacturing techniques, material choices, and decorative elements unique to different tribal traditions. The deliberate placement of these arrows, each marked with specific tribal designs, suggested a ritual aspect to the attack beyond its tactical execution. Warriors had intentionally left these marked arrows as signatures, ensuring their tribe's participation would be recognized in this coordinated demonstration of resistance. As summer arrived in 1867, the Bozeman Trail emerged as General Augur's most significant strategic challenge, casting a long shadow over military operations in the territory. The devastating Fetterman defeat had forced a wholesale reassessment of the military's defensive strategy regarding Forts Reno, Phil Kearney, and C.F. Smith. The Army's response manifested in a substantial force deployment. The combined strength of the 18th and 27th Infantry Regiments, alongside elements of the 2nd Cavalry, stationed more than 900 officers and soldiers across the three forts. Additionally, a construction force of 500 men labored to establish Fort Fetterman, intended to serve as a crucial southern anchor for the precarious supply route. Despite this considerable military presence, the defensive posture proved remarkably limited in its effectiveness. The garrisons found themselves essentially restricted to protecting their immediate surroundings, unable to project power beyond their walls. The Powder River Chiefs demonstrated their tactical superiority by maintaining effective control over the trail throughout 1867, permitting passage only to heavily armed military convoys. Their strategy proved remarkably successful. Civilian traffic to Montana via the Bozeman Trail virtually ceased, rendering the route commercially non-viable. The Native American forces applied sophisticated pressure tactics against Forts Phil Kearney and C.F. Smith, replicating the successful strategies that had previously undermined General Carrington's command. Their harassment operations created a constant state of tension, while intelligence suggested they were simultaneously developing plans for more decisive actions aimed at eliminating these fortifications entirely. However, the presence of these forts, though representing significant American military incursions into tribal territories, did not fundamentally disrupt the traditional patterns of Sioux and Cheyenne life. The tribes maintained their seasonal movements, following the bison herds eastward as they had for generations. They conducted regular raids into Colorado's frontier settlements, systematically targeted wagon trains along the Oregon Trail, and executed calculated strikes against the advancing transcontinental railroad construction efforts. This combination of traditional lifestyle maintenance and strategic military pressure demonstrated remarkable tactical adaptability in their resistance to territorial encroachment. General Hancock's ineffective response to Native American incursions into Kansas territory. The Army's capability gap stemmed from multiple sources, most notably the loss of experienced frontier officers during the Civil War years. The Republican administration in Washington had filled many crucial command positions with political appointees who lacked essential frontier combat experience, creating a leadership vacuum in precisely the region where experienced command proved most crucial. The military's tactical disadvantage became increasingly apparent as they confronted Native American combat methods. Traditional Army training proved inadequate against highly mobile warriors who employed sophisticated hit-and-run tactics, utilized superior knowledge of terrain, and demonstrated remarkable strategic coordination. The institutional knowledge of frontier warfare, carefully developed by previous generations of Army officers, had largely dissipated during the Civil War years, leaving the current command structure struggling to adapt to these unconventional combat challenges. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of the Washington Peace Commission in Kansas. Their presence created a strategic paralysis in military operations, particularly affecting General Sherman's ability to respond to hostile actions. Despite General Sully's commission achieving limited success in negotiations with friendly tribes along the Missouri and Platte Rivers, the broader peace initiative severely constrained military options. Sherman found himself unable to launch planned offensives against hostile Sioux bands, as any military action risked disrupting the delicate diplomatic process and endangering the peace emissaries. The practical challenges of frontier defense further complicated Sherman's strategic position. Continuous raids against Union Pacific Railroad construction required substantial troop deployments for protection, depleting forces that Sherman had intended for offensive operations. His frustration manifested in his stated desire to see the Powder River Sioux taken down a good many notches, yet the reality of resource constraints and diplomatic complications forced him to abandon his offensive plans after 3 months of strategic deliberation in early spring 1867. The arrival of spring brought renewed civilian traffic along the trail, as wagon trains departed Fort Kearney bound for Bozeman and Virginia City, their passage timed with the melting of snow in the Bighorn Mountains and surrounding valleys. The response from the Oglala and Menaconjou Sioux, along with their northern Cheyenne allies, was swift and coordinated. These tribal forces launched systematic operations aimed at removing what they viewed as encroachment on their territorial sovereignty, demonstrating both tactical sophistication and strategic resolve in their resistance efforts. In April, troubling news of the harsh winter hardships endured at Fort Smith and Fort Kearney spread through the streets of Bozeman City. The reports painted a grim picture of suffering, sparking anxiety among the citizens who feared for the survival of those stationed at the isolated outposts. Whispers of starvation and desperate conditions filled the town, fueling concerns that the frontier was becoming even more treacherous. Seeking to verify the alarming accounts and turn the crisis into an opportunity, John Bozeman, the very man who had charted the Bozeman Trail, set out eastward alongside his associate Thomas Cover. The two men, both seasoned frontiersmen and businessmen, hoped to establish flour contracts with the starving soldiers, a move that could secure both aid and profit. They pushed forward on horseback, navigating the well-worn trails that Bozeman himself had once blazed, unaware that this journey would be his last. Before reaching Fort Smith, tragedy struck. A war party of Blackfeet warriors appeared on the horizon, their presence an unmistakable warning. What transpired next remained shrouded in uncertainty, but the encounter ended in bloodshed. Bozeman was struck down, killed on the spot, while Cover, either through luck or swift maneuvering, managed to escape. The moment the news of Bozeman's death reached Montana, fear took hold. Panic rippled through the settlements, and many braced for what they believed was the beginning of a full-scale conflict with the Blackfeet. Acting Governor Thomas F. Meagher wasted no time responding. Convinced that an Indian uprising was brewing in the Gallatin Valley, he urgently appealed to Washington for military reinforcements. The weight of his request fell upon Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, who in turn consulted General William Tecumseh Sherman. Assessing the situation from afar, Sherman authorized Meagher to raise a force of volunteer soldiers, allowing the Montana Territory to take its defense into its own hands. But Meagher needed more than just permission. He demanded weapons, ammunition, and proper military equipment to arm his new force. His request, however, was met with skepticism. The division commander hesitated, sensing that something was amiss. Before approving the distribution of arms, he ordered a deeper investigation into the situation. What he uncovered cast serious doubt on Meagher's claims. Sherman found no credible evidence of an imminent Indian war, no mass uprisings, no strategic attacks, nothing that warranted an armed militia. The panic appeared to be built more on fear than on facts. One of the most damning criticisms came from August H. Chapman, a former Indian agent familiar with frontier dealings. Chapman publicly dismissed Meagher's so-called Indian War as the greatest fraud of the era. He argued that Meagher's true intent was not defense, but a calculated attempt to exploit the crisis for financial gain, specifically to funnel money from the U.S. Treasury. Despite the controversy, the volunteer militia was formed, and throughout the summer of 1867, armed patrols roamed the mining districts, watching the trails and settlements for any sign of attack. If Meagher's war in Gallatin Valley was an illusion, the conflict in the Powder River country was anything but. In the harsh frontier lands surrounding Forts Reno, Kearney, and C.F. Smith, conditions were dire. The small infantry garrisons tasked with defending these vulnerable outposts were stretched thin, struggling to shield desperate emigrants from starvation, cold, and hostilities. At Fort Smith, conditions bordered on the unbearable. Supplies dwindled, and as winter refused to release its grip, the troops and civilians alike faced an enemy even more relentless than any war party: hunger and exposure. In May, a glimmer of hope arrived for the embattled soldiers at Fort Smith. Two experienced mixed-blood scouts, Minton Bower and John Rushaw, finally reached Bozeman City after a grueling journey through hostile territory. Their mission was urgent. They had come to lead a wagon train of much-needed provisions back to the fort, where hunger and dwindling supplies had pushed the garrison to its limits. The return journey was no less perilous, with every mile presenting the threat of attack, but they managed to guide the supply-laden wagons through, bringing relief to the desperate soldiers. At the same time, Captain Kearney, who had been struggling to keep the fort operational, sent out a detachment of Crow Scouts with orders to ride to Fort Kearney and secure additional aid. But the supply lines were strained, and no relief arrived until early June. By then, Kearney had resigned his commission, weary from the mounting hardships and endless tension. With his departure, the weight of command fell upon Captain Thomas B. Burrows, who now assumed control of the isolated and vulnerable Fort Smith garrison. As summer drew closer, the threat from Sioux war parties intensified. In late June, a raiding band struck with precision, creating chaos just outside the fort's stockade. Under the cover of darkness, they stampeded a herd of 39 mules and a picketed horse, sending the animals fleeing into the wilderness before the soldiers could react. It was a calculated attack, a deliberate attempt to weaken the fort's ability to sustain itself. But the Sioux warriors weren't finished. They turned their aggression toward nearby Crow villages, harassing the traditional enemies of their people. Their boldest assault came 40 miles from Fort Smith, where they ambushed a supply train, cutting off livestock and further tightening the noose around the struggling garrison. Fort Kearney suffered the same relentless attacks. The once steady traffic along the Bozeman Trail slowed to a mere trickle before ceasing altogether. The lifeline to the forts was severed. Without cavalry, there was no way to chase down the raiding warriors, who struck with impunity. The frustration was voiced by Indian agent C.T. Campbell, who condemned the situation with bitter clarity. The hostiles, he wrote, passed the military posts, garrisoned with infantry, as a traveler does a signpost, and return along the same road with scalps and plunder. The situation inside Fort Smith grew increasingly dire. By mid-July, the garrison stood at a mere 60 men, many of them weakened by exhaustion and malnutrition. Their primary weapons, worn-out Springfield muzzle-loading rifles, were relics from another era, unreliable and slow compared to the repeating rifles now favored by their enemies. Discipline and morale crumbled as weeks dragged on without reinforcements. Desertions mounted, with men slipping away under the cover of night, unwilling to face what seemed like inevitable destruction. Then came the worst news yet. On July 12th, Crow Scouts returned with an urgent warning. Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, their ranks swelling by the day, had gathered in the Rosebud Valley just east of the fort. The scouts carried chilling intelligence. The enemy was preparing for an all-out assault on Fort Smith. Burroughs wasted no time. He immediately dispatched riders south, carrying desperate pleas for reinforcements. The waiting was agonizing. Every man in the garrison knew what was coming. With their numbers already diminished and their defenses stretched thin, it seemed only a matter of time before the storm broke over them. Their spirits suffered another devastating blow when the post surgeon, likely pushed past the brink of sanity by the relentless tension, succumbed to madness. But Burroughs' desperate appeals finally bore fruit. Help was on the way, but whether it would arrive in time remained uncertain. On July 17th, 2 companies of the 27th Infantry set out northward, moving with purpose under the guidance of the legendary frontiersman Jim Bridger. At the head of the column rode Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley, the newly designated commander of Fort Smith. A battle-hardened veteran of the Union Army, Bradley carried the distinction of Brevet Colonel and Brigadier General, honors earned through acts of gallantry and meritorious service at Resaca and Chickamauga, 2 of the bloodiest battles of the Georgia campaign. Accompanying the soldiers was a small immigrant train, pressing forward under the relative safety of military escort. Alongside them, a Wells Fargo supply train, under the direction of civilian contractor A.C. Lawton, made its slow advance. The convoy carried more than just provisions. Lawton's wagons bore desperately needed food supplies and, more crucially, several crates of 50 to 70 Allen-modified breech-loading Springfield rifles, modern replacements for the outdated, sluggish muzzleloaders the garrison had been forced to rely upon. These new weapons would give the soldiers of Fort Smith a fighting chance against the fast-moving, well-armed warriors they faced. The march toward Fort Smith remained uneventful, at least on the surface. Each day, distant figures appeared along the ridgelines, shadowing the column's progress. They were hostile warriors, ever watchful, studying their movements. Though they kept their distance, their presence was an unmistakable warning. The plains were not theirs to travel unchallenged. But the soldiers were not the only ones being followed. Crow Indians, drawn by the lure of trade, trailed the column, eager to barter for supplies, particularly sugar, a rare and valuable commodity. Unlike the hostile bands that lurked on the outskirts, the Crows rode openly, their presence tolerated, if not entirely trusted. On July 23rd, after days of steady marching, the column finally arrived at Fort Smith, where Bradley formally assumed command. The reinforcements wasted no time establishing themselves, setting up camp just beyond the fort's stockade as they awaited the construction of proper accommodations. 3 days later, Bradley made a decisive move. He ordered his men to abandon their temporary camp and relocate within the fort's perimeter, occupying tents until barracks could be built. His reasoning was clear. He did not trust the nearby Crow encampment. Though the Crows had so far been peaceful, their proximity posed a risk. Bradley preferred to keep his troops close, unwilling to gamble on what could happen should tensions flare between the soldiers and the warriors camped just beyond the walls. In late July 1867, following the sacred rituals of the annual Sundance, the Powder River bands gathered in a massive war council along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. This great enclave brought together warriors from the Oglala Sioux and Northern Cheyenne, as well as contingents of Miniconjou and Sans Arc Sioux, alongside their allies, the Northern Arapaho. Bound by a shared purpose, their leaders reached a bold resolution. They would destroy the military strongholds that had been planted deep in their lands, Forts Phil Kearney and C.F. Smith. Yet unity in purpose did not mean unity in execution. A dispute erupted over which fort should fall first, as each faction pushed for its preferred target. The debate was settled in the traditional fashion, by allowing warriors to choose their own path. Between 500 and 800 warriors, primarily Cheyenne and Arapaho, rode off toward Fort CF. Smith, while another force of nearly 1,000, led by none other than RedCloud himself, turned their sights on Fort Kearney. Even as the warriors gathered for war, the soldiers inside both forts were making quiet preparations of their own. That same month, fresh reinforcements and new commanders had arrived. Colonel John E. Smith, leading the 27th Infantry, assumed command of Fort Kearney, while his subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley, took charge of Fort C.F. Smith. Despite these reinforcements, Fort Kearney's total strength, just over 300 men, including civilian contractors, was actually weaker than it had been under its previous commander, Colonel Carrington. But the most significant change, one that would prove decisive in the battles ahead, remained unknown to the warriors approaching the forts. Smith and Bradley had brought with them a game-changing advantage, the new breech-loading Allen Springfield rifles, a vast improvement over the outdated 1861 Springfield muzzleloaders. These modern trapdoor rifles, paired with metallic cartridges, meant that each soldier could fire faster and reload in seconds, rather than fumbling with powder and ball under the pressure of an attack. While neither fort now stood in immediate jeopardy, their vulnerabilities lay beyond their walls. Fort C.F. Smith's greatest weakness was its outpost, a hay-cutting camp situated 2.5 miles northeast, down in the creek bottom. There, isolated from the safety of the stockade, a detachment of soldiers and civilian laborers worked each day harvesting fodder for the fort's livestock, unaware that an enemy force was already moving against them. Civilian contractors labored tirelessly, scything the tall prairie grass to ensure both Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Kearney had enough hay to sustain their horses through the harsh frontier conditions. Recognizing the ever-present danger of attack, they had constructed a makeshift defensive corral, a square enclosure, roughly 100 feet on each side, built from logs and reinforced with willow boughs woven along pole stringers. This hastily built fortification stood as their only hope of refuge should warriors descend upon them. At Fort Kearney, the demand for resources was even greater. Woodcutters continued their work in Carrington's old pinery, harvesting timber from the Bighorn Mountains just as they had in previous years. With hundreds of infantry, cavalry, and civilian laborers stationed at the post, the fort required a steady supply of construction materials, fuel for cooking, and firewood to prepare for the brutal winter ahead. The work was relentless, and the dangers were real. The woodcutting camp lay 5 miles west of the fort, leaving those stationed there isolated and vulnerable should hostiles decide to strike. Meanwhile, far from these military outposts, warriors of the Plains tribes had gathered to partake in one of their most sacred and grueling traditions, the Sundance. An annual ritual of immense spiritual significance, it was an act of penance and prayer, a trial of endurance that tested the limits of a warrior's spirit, strength, and devotion. Stripped down to nothing but his breechcloth, the warrior stood before his people, preparing to offer himself in sacrifice. Wooden splints or skewers pierced through the flesh of his chest, locking him into the sacred trial. A rawhide cord connected the skewers to the upper end of a tall pole, which had been planted firmly in the earth. Then, leaning back, he surrendered his weight to the tether, allowing his body to hang, his flesh stretched and tearing under the strain. The pole bent forward, causing his body to sink nearly halfway to the ground, yet his feet remained planted, bearing only a fraction of his weight. In his left hand, he clutched his favorite bow, a symbol of his warrior spirit. In his right, he gripped his medicine bag, holding on to the sacred power of his ancestors. From the rising of the sun in the east to its setting in the west, he endured, his gaze locked on the sky, following the sun's path across the heavens. Blood slowly trickled down his body, painting his skin, which had been covered in white and yellow clay. Around him, a great crowd gathered, chanting, praying, and offering encouragement. Yet he remained detached from them all, his mind and soul focused solely on his sacrifice, his pain, his communion with the Great Spirit. Among the gathered crowd, mystery men, the sacred spiritual guides of the tribe, sat in a circle around the young warrior, their voices rising in a rhythmic, unrelenting chant. Their drums thundered, rattles shook in their hands, and their songs, loud, piercing cries, filled the air, meant to fortify his spirit, to keep his heart strong as he endured his trial beneath the open sky. The warrior, his body hanging by the skewers driven through his chest, remained unmoved by the voices of the people around him. His only focus was the path of the sun, from its golden ascent in the morning to its fiery descent beyond the western horizon. If his strength did not fail, if he endured without collapsing, he was finally cut down at sunset. By then, a pile of gifts had been laid before him throughout the day, offerings from his family, from fellow warriors, and from those who revered his sacrifice. These presents of great value were now his, a sign of his new status. More importantly, he was given a new name, one that carried with it the weight of his sacrifice and his connection to the Great Spirit. Along with this name came a style of medicine, a spiritual power bestowed upon him through the trial, one that would define him and ensure his place of respect and honor for the rest of his life. Across the vast landscape of the Little Bighorn, hundreds of poles stood, scattered like sentinels, each holding a young warrior undergoing the same test of endurance and faith. Their bodies trembled, their prayers rose to the sky, and their spirits cried out for a vision, for a sign from the Great Spirit, guiding them toward their destiny. They danced in place despite the pain, their feet shifting upon the sacred ground, their souls reaching beyond the physical realm in search of meaning. In the days that followed, the entire village would erupt in celebration. Feasts were prepared, fires burned brightly, and family and friends gathered to praise the young braves, for they had passed through fire and emerged as men. With this rite of passage completed, new chapters of life awaited them. Wives would be chosen, sometimes more than one, if the warrior had the wealth to afford them. In accordance with tradition, he would offer horses, weapons, tobacco, or buffalo robes in exchange for his bride, bargaining with her family for the union. Within this religious and familial fervor, with spirits high and hearts filled with purpose, it was easy to see how these warriors, having just emerged from their sacred transformation, would be ready to follow their chiefs into battle. Their trials had forged them, their visions had given them clarity, and now they stood prepared to fight, not just as men, but as warriors blessed by the Great Spirit. Late in July, as the rosy red fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, thousands of warriors mounted their finest war horses, their figures silhouetted against the breaking light. With final farewells exchanged, they spurred their mounts forward, splitting into their respective war parties. Many carried with them new names bestowed upon them by the Great Spirit, a mark of their endurance, vision, and newfound power. The Cheyenne and Arapaho turned north, galloping across the open plains toward Fort C.F. Smith, a little over 20 miles away, their numbers swelling as they advanced. Meanwhile, far to the south, RedCloud and his warriors rode for Fort Phil Kearney, a 90-mile journey that would bring them face to face with the soldiers who had trespassed upon their land. He did not seek mere battle, he sought victory, a final reckoning against the Wasatch intruders who had defiled the Powder River country. Armed with visions from the Great Spirit, strengthened by their overwhelming numbers, and driven by a righteous fury, these warriors surged forward, determined to strike a decisive blow. The war that had been simmering in the shadows was now ready to erupt into open conflict. If you want to hear more about these legendary battles and the warriors who shaped history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this epic saga.